Welcome to the MIT Press Live, a new virtual event series brought to you by the MIT Press. My name is Nicholas DeSabatino. I'm the Global Publicity Manager here at the Press. I'm filling in for our regular host, Hannah Nyren, who is our Digital Marketing Manager. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Marco Bertini and Oded Konigsberg, authors of The Ends Game, How Smart Companies Stop Selling Products and Start Delivering Value, which we published this past fall. The Ends Game is the latest entry in our Management on the Cutting Edge series in partnership with MIT Sloan Management Review. Books in this series explore the digital frontiers of management and present original research from leading lights in academia and industry, providing practical advice to business leaders on how to prepare for the exciting and challenging future that awaits us. In its review, Strategy in Business writes, a superb, nuanced, and wide-ranging book, The Ends Game is a must-read for anyone involved in strategy, business model design, marketing, customer relations, or organizational development. In a review for Inc., Richard Reisman writes, this is a deeply researched and insightful work, offering a coherent vision of why playing the ends game is the future of business. It lays out a concise manifesto for business model disruption, centered on revenue models, and explains why pricing models are the essence of business. It offers conceptual grounding supported by a wide range of examples in a style that is neither abstract nor buried in anecdote. Great to see you both today. How are you both doing?
Doing great.
Thank you, guys. Could you both introduce yourself in a sentence or two?
Yeah, of course. My name is Oded Konigsberg, and I'm a professor in London Business School, and I'm teaching here for the last 8 years, almost 9 years. And my background is engineering in operation research. And then I shifted slowly into marketing, and I'm teaching marketing since 2002, first in Columbia University, and now in London.
And I'm Marco Bertini. I'm a professor at the moment at ESADE Business School in Barcelona. I'm Italian by origin, grew up in Australia. My background is in, I guess now they call it behavioral economics. It used to be called decision science a long time ago. But I've been in the marketing department ever since I finished my PhD.
Great, well, thank you both. So first off, what inspired this book?
So, you know, Nicholas, Marco and I are teaching pricing for many years, and we have numerous discussions with managers around pricing, and we recognize a gap. And the gap comes from the fact that, you know, in the evolutionary process of business, there was a change from center around product and service as unit of analysis to consumers. So in many cases, in many instances, in many dimensions, consumers become the center of the business world. And a lot of the analysis, a lot of the design was around consumers. Specifically, if we take a design of services and product, we listen to the customers, we design product and services around it, we design the communication around it, we design the way to get to the consumers around consumers, what consumers want, what consumers need. This wasn't the case with pricing. So pricing, in some sense, when the reciprocity was needed, when consumers have to find ways to take back some of the value that they created to consumers, the center was the product, the center was the consumers, the service, and not consumers. And we found it odd. We found it that it's basically creates some inefficiency for these firms, and there is a need for change there, and there is a need to recognition of what are the challenges and how to address them. So that's one piece. The second thing is when you look, actually, when you ask consumers, in many cases, you see that there is a answer for the following, and I'll give you an example of one or two questions that I like to ask in my audience. There is basically the answer, is it odd in what firms are doing? So for example, if you ask managers, consumers, what do you like to pay for? Healthcare or health? Do you prefer to pay for education or for a school? For groceries or nutrition, the answer is obvious. We want basically to get nutrition. But in most cases, companies are charging for different things. That was another source of inspirations for this book.
Great. So this book was a joint effort. How did you guys work together? How was the writing process? You guys have known each other a long time, and you've worked on different projects together. You know, tell us how you met and what it was like working with each other.
So yeah, we worked together so much time that you can see how we are kind of alternating answering the questions already, as you can see. So Oded and I think knew each other since about 2012, more or less. I was at London Business School at the time, and he joined London Business School from Colombia. And kind of both passionate guys, both loud speaking, you know, he's Israeli, I'm Italian. And we came at the same business problems from very different perspectives. Oded was mentioned to you before that he's kind of in operations and he thinks about world in a modeling sort of way. I think about the world in terms of experiments. And so we fought a bit, and then we made a peace, and then we fought again. And then we realized, okay, maybe there's some synergy we can actually provide between the two of us. And aside from that, we became very good friends. And so we started thinking about this issue of revenue models. We were also driven by this idea that when you think about pricing, companies think about prices, you know, like how much. And we thought that's a really tactical question. What about the more strategic one? You know, how should you think about your revenue? And so we said, okay, let's look around. Nothing that we saw satisfied us, and we started working together. And he's in London, I'm in Barcelona, so I was flying to him, he was flying to me. This is before, you know, the current times. He was flying to me, I was flying to him. We were meeting for the weekend, getting some work done, and the book came out of it.
The trips to London and Barcelona was a challenging part of writing the book, no doubt.
Well, thank you for sharing that story. So next, I'm going to ask you both just to tell us a little bit more about the book, The Ends Game. And can you explain the question on the cover, which says, would you rather pay for healthcare or better health, school or education? Instead of focusing on the means, learn to play the ends game. And Oded, you started talking about this just a little bit in your introduction, but could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, so I think probably the answer for that will be throughout the next 45 minutes, but I'll start. And I think if I have to tell about the book, and I think a good way to describe it is to discuss the framework. And the framework of the book is basically goes around three what we call in different ways inefficiencies, waste that we identify. And it's basically excess consumption and performance. And in a nutshell, when we talk about this type of waste, we speak excess is whether consumers cannot have access to the product because of the lack of resource, of lack of time, some constraint they have. Consumption is when a consumer does not consume everything he could, or she or he could or should consume. And performance waste is basically when the product does not provide the value that consumers expecting to receive from the product. And these are the three types of, we think, tensions, issues that stand between the consumers and the service provider, consumers and the firm, the product manufacturer. And basically what we try to do is to try to address it from different angles. And we believe, so first we basically have a roadmap of recognizing these inefficiencies with different organizations, understanding the source for that, and then providing different types of solutions, understanding that not every solution is feasible for all companies. So obviously companies have to make decisions, but that's basically, if I have to, in a nutshell, that's basically the book.
Let me just, Nicholas, allow me just to say a couple of more words on this. Kind of adding my own sort of view on this. I think what I personally found, I think with that too, what found striking was that, you know, you've got a world out there of research. There are books and subscriptions that are great, books on sharing models that are great, books on pay for performance that are great, books on pay as you go that are great. So there's all this talk and buzz around business models, revenue models. And we were in part motivated by this idea that, hey, is there a way of putting everything into one theory, right? So if you look at from the consumer side, because we're marketers in the end, so we look at things from consumers, right? From customers. And we said to ourselves exactly what Ed was saying. What things must the customer have in order to derive value? Because in the end, the firm wants to provide value to customers, right? So what things must the customer do? Well, the customer must access the good, otherwise game over. The customer then must consume the good, otherwise also game over. No access, there's no consumption, there's no value there. And third and final, you have to access, consume, and it has to perform. If there's no performance, game over. So these three things are like necessary and sufficient conditions, essentially. Okay. And guess what? All of the different models that are out there can actually fall into this line. And we thought it was kind of neat. And we wanted to talk about it.
That's great. Thank you both for giving that really great kind of preview of what the book is about. So, as we get started here, Marco and Oded will kind of take it away. Then we'll allow time for a few questions that I've prepared towards the end, and then we'll have time for folks in the chat to submit their questions in the Q&A function. So let's get started.
The floor's out. So I'll start off. And by the way, Nicholas, if we tend to speak a lot about these things, so whenever you want to cut us off, just let us know for time for question and answer. So let me just start by saying, look, the book is organized in three parts. Okay, so I think it's an important thing to say. And the reason why it's in three parts is because we felt there was a need to provide context to the reader. So that would be part one. Then actually explore all of these models that I was just talking about and Oded was talking about from the perspective of customers and the idea of waste. And then the all-important third part, which is really about, well, now if you buy into our theory and you're scared and you want to do something about it, what should a company do? Okay, so there's three parts there: context, models, and organization, action. I'll start with the context. So in terms of context, we basically saw two things that we want to highlight to the reader. The first thing is understanding as a firm the evolution of customer orientation. Okay, and Oded mentioned a little bit this before in the introduction. So if you look at from the dawn of commerce, I suppose, before the 60s, we were organizations that really made stuff and shoved it down the throats of customers, right? And then folks like Theodore Levitt came around and said, hey, that's the wrong way of doing it. If you really want to grow, you should be thinking about the holes in the walls, not the drills. Remember the famous quote, right? Yes. So you started having this idea of thinking about customer needs and then developing products on the basis of those customer needs so that you can separate yourself from the competition, maybe get a premium in the marketplace. So, and then of course, we had to find a way of making this massively available. So you start having production efficiencies. At the beginning, every Ford car was black, I think. And then after that, the Model T, right after that, it became other colors, I assume. From there, then we said, okay, now we've got mass production, great, listening to customers. We need mass distribution. So you started having, in the sake of efficiency, you started having this idea of like getting to customers in a very efficient way. So we had the franchise models, retail models, different channel structures. Then we had mass communications because now there's more competition. So we have to get in the ear of customers. So we have to speak loudly. So we started having advertisements, commercials, whatnot, right? In the sake of this efficiency, folks looked at the price and said, okay, well, we need to unify this as one single price, okay? Otherwise, it's very hard to have different prices like in the old barter system, right? For all these customers. Because technologically, and this is the key word, technologically, it was just hard to make everything so personalized when it comes to the pricing side of things. So kind of, if you think about the good old 4 Ps in marketing, which hopefully I remember them, I don't make a fool of myself right now: product, place, promotion, and price. There we go. Price was like, the one left behind, okay? It wasn't as customer focused as it was. So at the beginning of our context part of the book is really about saying, organizations, your customer orientation journey is not complete. You've done the product part, the distribution part, the communication part. Your price is not really customer focused in the sense that it's internally driven from your costs and it doesn't really adapt to the customer valuations that you see. Then the second part of the context section, the second chapter in the context part of the book, it says, hold on a second, that was a technological problem before, but look around now, the technology is there now in place to make this, to not lose efficiency and actually develop propositions that are adapted to the customer's valuations. So think about cloud computing, think about microtransactions, think about sensors in particular, right? This day and age, I have, as an organization, I have insight into what my customers are doing beyond the moment of purchase that I didn't have before. To say it in a different way, I now can have, if I want to, insight into these inefficiencies that Oded was talking about before, right? I can see how much access problem there is in the marketplace. I can see how much consumption problems there are, how much performance problems there may be. And so if I can see them, then we have an interesting proposition, we have an interesting challenge or question mark as an organization. I'm a company, I'm sitting very comfortably where I am right now. I'm an incumbent. I can see all this inefficiency by the customers. They're suffering in that sense. Do I address it and maybe increase my market share, increase the willingness to pay with these customers, or do I just sit where I am and just feel happy? But if I do that, guess what happens? I guess the ugly word that sometimes we say, which is disruption, right? You start seeing a lot of disruption this day and age because technology is great, but technology enables organizations to disrupt on the basis of what customers want. I always tell my students, Nicholas, that that customers have the wallets in their pockets or the money in the bank account. So we're chasing their demand. And if they find a better deal somewhere else, somebody inadvertently will provide it at some point. Okay, so the first part of the book is really about setting the context. The customer journey is not really not finished yet. And second of all, technology can let you as an incumbent or maybe as a startup come in and provide a better deal, align yourself through your revenue model with customers, which at first sight may seem like you enter into wild territory, but actually at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're increasing the pie, the value that is being shared between you and customers. Right? And then I think Oded's going to talk about the second part, right?
Yeah, so the second part is basically the models itself, and it resonates and connect to the three types of waste I mentioned earlier: excess, consumption, and performance, and everything for build on everything Marco was saying earlier. So when we talk about excess, there are, if you go and dive more into details, there are physical excess, where basically there is capacity constraint. It can be physical capacity constraint, or it can be obviously a virtual capacity constraint, and consumers do not have access to a product. They not really access the product and receive it. And there is a financial access constraint, which is basically, for example, lack of resources to purchase a product, or the fact that there is a large assortment of product, and it's tough to get the product. And companies are basically, if you try to look at the solution that companies are trying to find to address this type of waste, we see a lot of membership and subscriptions. These are the two main types of solution. So take the latter example of the financial about assortment. All of Netflix, which is a subscription-based company, does, it allows us to get an access to a lot of media that we cannot own because it's too much. We don't have the capacity to buy so much media or music, Spotify. If you think about financial constraint of not have enough money to purchase a product, we can think about solutions that many of the car manufacturers provide today. Basically allow consumers, instead of owning a car, have a partial ownership of a car, subscribe to for a product, car by Volvo, one example, but literally almost every car manufacturer find and try to provide this type of solution, which basically allow access to consumers access to cars, which they may not be able to afford otherwise. Obviously, let's also go immediately to the consumption constraint and waste. Because when we talk about a car, I think there is no more natural link between the two, because in many cases with cars, one of the issues is the differences between our consumption rate to the ownership, because consumers do not use, for example, with cars, it's really noticeable. In average, we use 5% of we use the car 5% of the time. So in some sense, 95% of the time is idle. We do not, as consumers, do not really generate utility out of that. That's exactly what we refer as the consumption rate. The fact that consumers are not using the product all the time, while if they own the product, they have to buy for the product or the service for all the time to owning it, while the usage is much lower than that. And for that, companies and many of the solutions around that are basically around per use or per as you go type of product. There is one example I like a lot, is the Winterhalter. Winterhalter basically is a machinery, is a industrial washing machine, and they basically charge pay per wash. So instead of owning a machine and buying it, you pay only when you wash the product. And actually, if you link it, and there is the sensors linking it for what Marco said earlier, the sensor that we have there allows us today to really understand when consumers are using it. And it can be in B2B, but it also actually we see more and more companies are using it in B2C as well. Linking it even more, actually these sensors may allow us, and in some cases already allow us, to measure the quality of the usage, which basically goes to the last type of models, which is basically performance. But before that, another example which I really like is with I think significant social welfare unification is example of tractors, the use of tractors in places like Africa and India, where many of the farmers cannot use these products. So what basically type of the solution is you pay only when you use the product. So you need the product 1 hour a month, 2 hours a month. We'll make sure that you'll get an access for that. You'll pay for it for 2 hours a month, because clearly many of these farmers cannot buy the product, cannot own the product, and it's needed. And the last type, which is performance. In the performance, the question is, and the gap is that we basically do not pay for the benefits of the product. It's very clearly when you think about tangible products. Great example that I like to use is Orica. Orica is a manufacturer of explosive in the mining industries. And in this industry for years, companies used to charge per weight. So there was a measure was per weight, which basically opened the door for competition to charge and to lower quality competition to come. And what Orica did, they changed the platform of the pricing, that instead of charging per unit, per weight, they started to charge per performance. Their performance is walk on ground, which is basically a measure of performance there. But by doing so, they were able to shift the pricing and create a new, basically a new category and reduce and mitigate the effect of lower quality manufacturers. But it's not only with tangible. If you think about products like healthcare, when basically there is a huge gap between what consumers sometimes receive to what insurance companies or government are paying for, and there is a huge pressure from government to make sure that there is some control on pricing. When many of the companies, when the pricing in the pharmaceutical industry can go very high, there is basically, we see a wave, a pressure, and actually I see recognition, we see more and more recognition for companies for the need to tie between performance of medicines, of medical products, of medical procedures to the success of the product. Again, sensors can help us a lot because it can help to do several things. For example, if one takes a medicine and there is a sensor, the sensors can measure the effect of the medicine on a person, but also can see whether this person really followed the instructions. And the pricing can be a function of all of these, what consumers did and the performance of the medical. We see it in education. We need it in education to really see whether we can charge. And there is and I think we can later on discuss about some of these aspects in education of education. And lastly, the examples that I like a lot is when you think about media and what do we charge in media? And Netflix, for example, charge per subscription. Basically, all of us can use it. Doesn't matter how much you use it. Doesn't matter how much we enjoy it. And there's an example of a Barcelona, a Spanish company in Barcelona that is in Barcelona that is operating comedy clubs. And they find a way to, temporary, but it's a very unique way to basically charge per laugh. So laugh is a proxy, what we call a proxy for the value. Obviously, it's not exactly the value. We cannot measure exactly how much people enjoy, but laugh is a very close proxy to the way consumers really, the performance of the comedy club.
So then, Oded, I'm going to move on to the third part. But before that, I just wanted to stress something for the audience, because sometimes it can be a nuanced argument, and actually it took us a while to get our head around this. So we're kind of saying, look, folks, organizations, technology is allowing to enable, to enact, to put into practice revenue models that more closely align with the value customers derive. Sometimes all the way there, performance, sometimes a step before, consumption, sometimes 2 steps before, access. We make a few conclusions in the book. We are not saying, and I want to be clear about this, we're not saying, hey, you listen to this webinar and tomorrow you're going to go back to your boss and you change all of your revenue model to performance-based. Because there are costs involved, which I'll go through this in a second, and the mindset itself is very hard to shift. However, what we are definitely saying in the book is that in front of this technology, in front of these options, the classical way of charging for boxes and for services, that classical, what we call ownership model, is probably outdated in your industry. And if it's probably outdated, somebody can come in and do a better job than you can, and somebody can win that customer from you. So even though it might at first seem a little bit risky, a little bit uncomfortable to say, I want to move away from my very safe, very secure, very nice way of selling stuff and making money off stuff, think of 2 things. First of all, by having that traditional model, how many customers are you leaving out of the market? This is the financial access issue, for example. And even if they're buying from you, how many customers have reduced their willingness to pay implicitly because they're unsure of performance, they're unsure about the consumption. So just there, you can probably expand the pie. And then second of all, forget right now, what if somebody comes in and steals your pie tomorrow, right? So it's not a question of just basically survival. And throughout the book, we talk about a lot about disruption, and we have examples of both incumbents, but also startups that have come in and sort of eaten the cake of somebody else, so to speak. So if we are okay with that judgment, that's the way of thinking, I guess the question to spend some time on is, how should a company think about this, right? What kind of changes does it require? And so we spotted a few things that we talk about in the book. And admittedly, we could spend actually a whole book talking about that as opposed to one part of it. So first of all, it's a totally an obvious point, but you try and put that into practice, it becomes very hard. What outcomes are we actually selling as a company, right? So as an organization, how do we think about in terms of outcomes as opposed to products? How do we think about ends as opposed to means? And that's why we have the book is called The Ends Game, right? How do we think about that? And this can be a very challenging thing for organizations. For one, just the mentality of it. So we've done some work recently on a case study for Pearson, the education company. Oded was talking about education before. And in this case study, we sort of narrate their journey towards efficacy. They say to the world, hey, we are the world's leading learning company. We want to make people make progress through education and learning, but we sell textbooks and we've been selling courses. And so the CEO was really uncomfortable with that idea. And they've started moving since 2013 towards the idea of efficacy in learning, which required understanding what learning means. How many outcomes are there? How do they vary across people? How do we measure them? How do we measure them in a way that nobody can tamper with them? So when you start thinking about outcomes, you start peeling that onion, right? There's a lot of things that go into it, which actually make it a little bit tricky. So in the book, we talk about, the first thing we do is in this part, we talk about sort of thinking about outcomes, committing to them, defining them, scoping them, measuring them, what qualities must an outcome have. It should be quantifiable, verifiable, it should be independent. And then the next chapter in that part of the book, we talk about what we call the quality paradox, which is really a mindset chapter, in the sense that from all the companies that we've spoken through for the research of this book, we found it very interesting. The companies that have the most to gain from making a change in revenue model tend to be the companies that provide better value than somebody else. Clearly, if I'm going to make money on value, I better provide better value than the competition. But paradoxically, the same organizations are the ones that are most hesitant to do it. Hence the quality paradox. Why is that? Well, because the companies that really invest in quality have 2 problems going on for them. One, they love their quality. So their head is very much in the product, in the engineering, in the specification. So it's very hard for them to think about anything but that particular quality. And then 2, they invest a lot of cash in that quality. And therefore they kind of feel like they want to be conservative and recuperate their investment. And the safer way of doing it is defaulting back to a traditional revenue model. So we do that, and then we say, okay, we can solve the outcome question, we can get over the quality paradox. Then what other things do we need? Clearly, we need data, right? I mean, this is a data story, right? I need to understand what happens beyond the moment of purchase, as I was saying before. So we call this impact data. So we use this term impact data because we try to differentiate from the other kind of data that every good marketer tends to collect. Every good marketer collects data about customer needs and wants. Every good marketer collects data about customer journeys. That's very sexy these days. Understand the customer experience, understand where they're going, nudge them towards this purchase or towards that. Figuring out the omni-channel challenge, all of those buzzwords we use these days. But then we say that stops at the moment of purchase. I need data on impact. I need to understand what's happening once the customer brings the product home. When do they consume? How do they consume? How is it performing? To the extent that it's possible, I need to have that transparency, which, I won't go into it now, but then it also introduces a privacy question. To what extent in healthcare, for example, do we deal with privacy concerns of individuals who are trying to keep themselves sort of private in their health concerns? So we talk about data, how to collect data, and how to basically deal with the privacy issues. And then two more things, just to finish off. One of them is, and this can be a little bit nuanced again. So, if I'm a company that starts taking on risk because I'm shifting my revenue model towards the value of the customer, clearly I'm taking on risk because if the customer doesn't derive value, I'm not getting paid, right? At the same time, the risk comes off the shoulders of the customer, which is where it was before. So if I'm in a situation where my customer contributes actively in the creation of a quality outcome, and I'll give an example in a second, I need to be able to try to nudge my customer to behave properly. So take the Orica example that Oded was mentioning before, right? So Orica provides better blasts on a mining site, better explosions, which actually is the size of the rocks, ultimately. Now, it's the mine who does the explosion. The mine puts the explosives where they want to, right? And so me as Orica, I can provide the best possible dynamite in the whole wide world, but if my mine manager doesn't put them properly, if he starts throwing them around like this, it's not going to be a good blast. And so that's one example. Healthcare will be another example. If the patient doesn't take the pill at the right time, I am the one incurring that risk, me as the firm. So what mechanisms can I put in place to actually ensure that my customer behaves in a quality optimal way? Okay. So in the case of Orica, what do? They actually say, customer, sit down, I will do the blast. So in B2B cases, in industrial markets, you see this a lot, right? Where the seller kind of integrates downstream to actually do the applications, and they start selling things as a service, right? Blasting as a service. Or you might just simply have incentives. Look, if you behave in a certain way, then your share of the pie later on will actually be bigger. And therefore I can set incentives that way. And last but not least, Nicholas, we leave it for last because it's the biggest nut to crack, I suppose. When you actually want to make your move, there's you have to sort of navigate the politics of this very, very, very well, right? And some of the folks listening to this may be familiar with the concept of swallowing the fish. I don't know if any people have heard this term before, but the idea, if you can imagine a fish, right, where it's small on one end, big in the middle, and small on the other end again. The reason why they use that the metaphor is because when you try to make a move like this in business model and revenue models, typically your revenue will go down at the beginning. So think about the bottom of that fish, right? Your revenue will start going down at the beginning because you're shifting money to the future. You're shifting money to time, you're shifting money upon consumption, you're shifting money upon performance. And therefore that money that you were getting in today is being shifted to the future at the beginning. And then customers come in and, then I do what I was doing before. At the same time, your costs go up at the beginning. So that's the top of the fish. okay? Your costs are going up because you got new processes, you've got new technology, you got new this, new that. And so for some period of time, a year, two, what have you got? You got a situation where your costs are outstripping your revenue. And you have to manage that. So especially if you're a public company, you have to manage expectations because your performance is going to go down for a few years, hoping that, you swallow that fish in the end, and afterwards the lines will cross again, and then your revenue will outstrip your costs. So you have to manage these internally expectations. You have to manage it externally. You have to think to yourself, do I want to burn all the boats? Do I want to stop my old revenue model and start the new one straight away? Do I want to do an Adobe, right? Which they went from discs in cardboard boxes to subscriptions all of a sudden. You could, but you have to really manage expectations well. We don't have too many examples of that. Or do I want to manage different revenue models at one time? Do I want to have the ownership model? A car manufacturer still sells cars. Do I want to have a subscription model? Volvo sells the car and subscribes to a car. You can subscribe to a car. Do I want to have the consumption model at the same time? And if I do that, which seems safer, notice that customers will self-select into the better deal for them, which will also decrease your revenue at first. So again, you still have things to manage. So the whole process of managing these expectations is a tricky one. So for example, we've done research on HP and their move from selling ink, or their ongoing move from selling ink in cartridges to selling ink by subscription in a very, 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 very large organization, right? How do you make that? How do you navigate that in a way that sort of makes everybody happy? It's fascinating. We don't have the exact answer for that, but we certainly have some tips for that. And I think that's kind of takes us through all the book.
That's great. Thank you both for that really great presentation. We've been getting a lot of really good questions from the audience while you guys have been talking. So if you're okay with that, I'll start kind of jumping into that. And folks watching right now, please feel free to submit these to through our Q&A section. So I'm going to start reading some of them now and we'll go through them. So our first question right now is saying, you suggest that we question ourselves, what are we asking customers to pay for? And for that, what we need to define what an outcome is. What elements, apart from measurable, independent, and meaningful, should be considered? Can you give an example, please?
Well, then you're on mute.
Oh, sorry.
Notice. Thanks, guys. So I think very interesting in the sense that very challenging question in the sense, and I think one thing that we may not we're not clear in the presentation until now is that we recognize that paper outcome is almost like utopic for most companies. So this is the wishful desire. This is the desire we want to be. But for most companies, this is something that they will not be able to be. And if they will be, it will take a time and process. So in some sense, the way to look at it, so I totally sympathize. I think majority of the companies cannot charge for outcome. We can ask them to, so in some sense, what we urge managers to do is to understand the journey. So many companies are charging for the means, basically paper ownership of the service of the product. We ask them, okay, let's take you for a journey. First, understand what is the outcome, which is in many cases it is not clear that consumers and firms and sellers and buyers agree about the outcome. So let's see what is the outcome and explain what is the outcome. Can we measure the outcome? Can we charge for the outcome? If we can, how can we charge it? How does it going to affect the outcome? Because I gave the example of the paper laugh. I mean, if you charge people per laugh, guess what? They start to enjoy comedy in different ways. So we charge them less, so we can see some reaction. So performance, the value itself can be revealed in different ways, and we need to accommodate for that. Now, companies who cannot charge per value, then we need to say, okay, what are the results? And then if not, basically, can we charge for consumption? The pay as you go, and if not, can we charge per time, the metering, the subscription method, and if not, we go to the means. So in some sense, that's a journey, and managers have to understand what is the capabilities of charge in different ways. In addition, and that's another aspect of this question, is that we have to ask ourselves whether the consumers are ready for that, because there is basically the fact that we want to charge for consumers does not necessarily mean that consumers are willing to pay for that. and we can really measure it, and there is agreement about it. And so we really need to align it. And in some sense, I say that I say to managers, it's almost like price discrimination techniques in a different level, in a higher level, because we think about revenue models here. In many cases, you have to have a self-selection of consumers choosing the underlying revenue models that they want to follow. So that's also another ingredient of the book that we try to preach. We don't preach for pay-per outcome. We just say pay-per outcome may remove a lot of the inefficiencies, but we understand it may be costly or even impossible for many companies. Hopefully it answers the question there.
Let me just add one thing, Oded, to this.
Please, please.
So when I get this question from my students, I say everything that they just said, much worse, but I say it like he said it. And then I also would add the following. I think that when it comes to outcomes and value for customers, you kind of want to have three ingredients, and some of those were repeated in the question, but I just want to make sure that I communicate them again. You have to be meaningful. So you have to be relevant to customers. This is where the value originally comes from. So that's the very first thing. And even there, you can have a discussion as to whether the products that we design today are actually that meaningful and relevant to customers. Sometimes they're over-engineered, for example. Two, you want it to be unique. To the extent that your outcome is unique and differentiated, you're going to have a better time against competition down the line. So if you can preempt that now, better. And then you want it to be countable, right? And by countable, I mean three things within that. It has to be quantifiable by you. To the extent that it's possible, you put it into numbers, because numbers speak for themselves. It has to be verifiable in the case that the customer can actually check your premises and your promise on their own business. And by independent, what I mean is like the example that Oded was talking about, the theater, it should not be tampered. Because of course, if I am enjoying a show, but I'm not laughing, and I'm enjoying it in different ways, I'm not paying for that enjoyment, but I found a way to rig the system in a sense. Okay, so those are the kind of three dimensions that are important.
Those are really good answers. Thank you both. I'm going to segue to our second question, which I think fits in really nicely here. Do you think the customers really want to see personalized pricing, because it will mean that there will no longer be transparency? Customers seem to like the good, better, best approach to pricing because it provides an acceptable level of choice while maintaining market prices.
Okay, so I'll take that one there. So, so there is an implicit assumption here that personalized pricing leads to transparency, right? This question. So there's a few ways to go with, in my opinion, with an answer to this particular question. So what are we talking about here is not prices themselves. Okay, and this is kind of hard to get at the beginning. But so this book is really about not how much we're charging customers, but what are we charging our customers for? And so basically the book says, to the extent that it's possible, push yourself to mirror the value that customers are actually getting. Then later on, you can decide actually what price to charge. You can actually leave a lot of money on the table if you wanted to and give customers a lot of premium. You can try and extract everything. Or you can do something in between. That's a decision for a different book, the next book, I suppose, right? Because the decision on the revenue model is a decision about uncertainty and about risk, not about extraction. It's about making the pie bigger, essentially. So, but even if we go there and we say, okay, well, personalized prices, it's definitely complex. It's definitely complex. And yes, most times we tend to like some predetermined choice for ourselves. So predetermined choice is kind of like a heuristic that satisfies the marketplace. And that may be very well be true in most cases, but the thing that I like to remind my audience is that remember that the world is constantly changing. Yeah. We didn't talk about dynamic pricing 10 years ago. We've had good, better, best for 20 years, 30 years, actually much more than that, maybe 60 years now. And so just over the last 10 years, we start seeing dynamic pricing in airlines, in retail, you name it, right? And we don't complain about it so much because we don't see it. We just get our own price, essentially. And so, whereas I understand the benefit of heuristic because it simplifies things, and I totally get it, it's a shifting target. And with technology making things simpler and more explainable and more transparent and more justified, you may get to a stage where this is more common practice. Right? Oded, anything to add? No. You also on mute, Oded.
That's great. Thank you.
I think it covers most of it. Yeah, please.
So I think to get to our third question from the audience. So how do you make sure that customers don't feel that they are treated unfairly when they find out they paid more for a product than their neighbor?
So fairness it's always a challenge for managers, and usually it's really a challenge because it's a matter of perception, and there is no objective measurement for fairness. So one rule of thumb I always tell to managers and students that I've discussed pricing and fairness issues in pricing is that we have to be very sensitive to the perception of fairness of any of our actions, whether it's again any pricing tactic, strategy, or revenue model that we are using. We need to explain. But I mean, in one sense, I can totally sympathize with the fact with the a customer which is feel frustration that she pays more than the neighbor. But there are two things into that. One, the other neighbor, the neighbor probably feels that we are the best company in the world because she pays less than their neighbor. So there is the lack of reciprocity or the asymmetry between one customer to another. One customer pay more, the other customers pay less. The second thing is, and if you look at really tailor it to the level of and to the wasting, is that when we charge the same price for all customers, we actually are unfair to them, because there is a differences in the way consumers use the product in terms of the performance, the value that they generate from the product, in terms of the consumption rate. So they use it in different ways. So charging the same price actually is meaning that we are charging different price per consumption usage or for value that they generate. So we discriminate in a different way. I'm not sure which one is better. So that's also there is two ways to look at that. And I think really the challenge for managers will be to make sure that the pricing strategies or the revenue models that they use will self-explain the value and remove these fairness concerns for customers. And transparency can definitely is a first step. If consumers understand how does a revenue model is crafted and why one customers pay more than others, it can remove some of the fairness concern. But I do sympathize. In the end of the day, managers need to be very sensitive about the perception of fairness. And it might be the case that even although we believe that our revenue model is the most fair in the world, consumers will not see eye to eye, and we need to revise and change our pricing policy.
Nicholas, there is some interesting research in marketing and in behavioral research in marketing that sort of says that if you ask consumers, individuals, about their lay beliefs about price discrimination, essentially charging different prices to different customers, they always think about the negative aspect of it, right? Hey, I'm going to be paying more than what otherwise would be somebody else is paying. But again, and this is sort of underlining what Oded was saying, there is another side of it. There's some people are actually paying less than you, and that might be a good thing. So think about all these categories where access, going back to access, is an issue. Healthcare, education, now I'm struggling for words, but transportation, those utilities, those basic goods that we need in order to survive, food, nutrition. Okay, so in those kind of categories, you actually want some price discrimination. And I know it sounds bad, the word, because you want to be able to reach the bottom of the pyramid, so to speak, the bottom end of the marketplace that otherwise would not be served. And you want them to be served because they need to be served. Okay, so there is a kind of so from a company's perspective, you want to be able to understand how to communicate that properly, right? Yeah.
That's good to hear. Thank you. A member in the audience would like to ask or would like to know if there are pricing models that work better specifically for B2B and others for B2C.
Right. Yeah, that's a classic question that we always get in, and also like products and services. It's a great question. It's one that we often get. So one thing that I'm particularly proud about this book, if I may be not so modest for a minute, is that I think we really worked very hard to make this about fundamentals. So this issue about access, consumption, and performance is general. It applies to any market, whether it's B2B or B2C. Okay, then, so that's going to be there. Now, the question then is, where is the most inefficiency in a given marketplace? And so if you think about, I don't know whether this member of the audience is from B2C or B2B, so I don't know exactly which way to slant my answer. But if you think about these two types of marketplaces, what do you have? In the B2B context, you tend to have better measurement. the attribute, the benefit that drives value is more quantifiable. It's easy to understand what the customer wants. The customer wants profitability because it's a business. So you tend to have this sort of easier, I was going to say easierness, but that's not a word. It's slightly easier to understand and get your hands around performance. On the other hand, I think maybe it's fair to say that in B2C, you go a situation where access becomes much more important, especially those industries that I was mentioning before, things like healthcare, education, utilities. And so most of the inefficiency you want to solve is down there. And the consumption rates might actually be much more, so if in a B2C context, the difference amongst consumers, many millions of consumers potentially in terms of consumption patterns, may be a lot bigger than if I have 2 or 3 or 4 customers in the B2B context. So you might observe that. So the point I guess I'm trying to say is that the fundamental principles of access, consumption, and performance are going to be there and felt by any market of any type. But of course, some of the nuances of B2B apply better to, like, for example, performance markets and performance problems, better said. And then some of the nuances of B2C might be better for like consumptions and access. But it need not be the case. I'm just generalizing here. Yeah.
No, that's good to hear. Thank you. This is a big question, this next one. Does personalized pricing take into consideration systematic racism built into how different individuals experience the discounts and value?
So yeah, this is I think this is one of the important questions of pricing in general. And I have to be in opposite to basically the way Marco started the previous answer. I have to be very modest here. We don't address this issue explicitly in this paper, so I'll give you my view here because the book does not address it. Because remember, the book is basically about in the level of revenue models, when you try to find ways that firms can translate the product in a way that removes some of the waste that exists. Now, the waste are general for everyone, all type of customers. We don't dive here into the level of consumers and basically speak about personal pricing because the principles are the same for all customers. Because customers in our case will pay different prices because they value the product differently, the consumption rate is different, or they have different level of access. But we don't dive into the measurement because in order to take into account the systematic differences between groups of consumers, we need to dive into the data part and do we really provide different prices or different models for different groups? And the book actually shy away. In one sense, it's strategically, if we think about it, a strategy, tactics, application, we are in the strategy level. We don't dive into that. I do agree and sympathize, and we know that there is in many cases there is a systematic biases, and algorithms have to be adjusted when adapted in order to remove it. But again, make sure the book is actually, in this case, the book does not address, does not go to the level of how to personal pricing. Marco,
yeah, I wanted to add because this is something that I know that me and Odette care about a lot. It's something that, in fact, that we're actually working on an article about this very question at the moment. So again, it's beyond the book, but it's just our opinion. So we're trying to write an article where we're trying to help managers understand the potential problems of employing machines, algorithms, to set prices, right? And I suppose most folks in the audience may have read articles in the popular press about how machines are black boxes, but of course you can infuse discrimination by different groups in like the data that you put in, the way you specify the algorithms. And this typically, I would imagine, I would like to think is not conscious, but nevertheless, it comes out. So what we're trying to figure out is, what kind of systems can we put in practice to stop that from happening? Because ultimately, even if you mean it or not, the end result is there and people get upset, and rightly so. And we don't want that as a company. I imagine we don't want that to happen, okay? And so, although the book doesn't deal with it, personalized pricing totally can lead to, let me give you a quick and dirty example. Up until a few years ago, it was perfectly okay to charge different prices depending on gender, right? But now with the internet, people are complaining about it, rightly so, and that's been legally stamped out, right, through regulation. And so totally can we like to take a positive view that most managers don't want that to be an outcome.
Yeah.
And we're trying to figure out a way of actually ringing the bells, to alert them.
That's a really good answer. Thank you both. I think we have time for about one more question. And this one's from Richard Reisman. So while impact data reveals much about the customer's ends and how well they are achieved, it treats the customer as a black box. Some insight is better obtained by asking the customer what is in their head, what they actually think and feel. Please comment on where that is done now and how it can be done more and better in the future as we apply computer-mediated dialogue with our customers and respond in a mass customized way.
Yeah, so I'll start with that, I think, right? So thank you, Richard, for the question. So I think it's a very valid point, right? So the book is somewhat skewed towards large scale data, right? Because we're trying to help organizations make move in their revenue models, and that requires data at certain scale. Sometimes I would imagine, and I'm kind of thinking on my feet here, right? Sometimes when we talk about outcomes and talk about the measurement of outcomes, the type of outcomes that we want to measure, and I would imagine this, we're talking more about B2C context, are things that are very emotional, at times non-conscious. And data is not gonna, most likely data won't reveal that because this is non-conscious things, right? And so you do need to complement in some way that I would need to think through, complement the large scale data gathering efforts with qualitative analysis that has been around for a long time, to like experiential interviewing, for example, to get inside the customer's head, so to speak, and understand their mental models. And if you can do that, then I guess the next step would be as an organization to think about how I take the mental model and convert it into metrics, proxies that I can literally observe and get information at scale. If none of that is happening and none of that can be done, again, like Oded was saying before, we are not wedded to the performance-based outcome revenue model. We would say, hey, that's just not in our field right now. Research technology is not advanced to that point. Let's step back and think about consumption patterns, which we can measure without getting into the head of customers, right? So I would answer it that way, I think.
And then, this question actually linked to a question that was asked before about when do we do it in B2B and B2C. There is another element of that. And I would say another way to look at it, Richard, is to think about the product category. So, in several product categories, actually, when we look at the ends, I would say that most of these products, the data, this is not a massive amount of data. We need the data, no doubt, but it's not about the massive amount of data. Then algorithmic pricing is less of an issue, and therefore, so that's important. That's important element there. I would argue that with products which are in mass marketing, which are basically we sell a consumer packaged good, electronic packaged good, I'm not sure that performance-based, the ends, is the way to really price it. Not now. And therefore, and in this case, I think Marco answer is definitely provide the way to go.
Well, I don't mean to interrupt. We are almost at the end of our time here today. You guys have done a wonderful job presenting the book. We've had some really great questions from the audience. We've got a few other ones that I'll be able to send you later on that you can respond to at a different time. There's going to be information in the chat about where, again, you can purchase a copy of the Ends Game, especially more information from our website, visiting different independent bookstores. We might actually have time for one more question. Let's see. You know what? Let me pull up my notes right here. So I think one that was actually provided by your wonderful editor, Emily Tabor, would be a nice way to kind of wrap up our talk today. And this is about COVID-19. So have you seen companies making adjustments due to COVID-19 and use this as an opportunity to change their revenue models along the access, consumption, performance spectrum, as you discuss in the book?
So I'll give you an answer off that one. I think I can think of one on top of my head, and then Oded can chime in. So subscriptions. So access has become So if you think about this, right? So COVID has unfortunately put a lot of people, both physically and financially, at in an access problem. So it's put people in an access problem, both physically and financially. Financially, because maybe, unfortunately, we are not working anymore. Physically, because I cannot leave my house, right? And so remember, physical access, financial access, physical access, what is the solution? Subscriptions. And guess what? Subscription models have completely outperformed the marketplace now, right? Now that we have a vaccine potentially and crossing our fingers, then maybe that will change. But in that particular period, you kind of seen a diversion, if that's the right word, where where access has become much more salient to people and much more of an inefficiency in a marketplace when ownership used to be done. And so you've seen a lot of companies saying to themselves, beyond making my things cheaper if I can, right? How can I facilitate access by changing my revenue model? So I think a lot of courageous companies have started exploring the idea of moving into subscriptions, taking that sort of quiet moment in the marketplace to make that change. So I think for sure subscriptions have benefited, if I can use that word, in the current context.
That's great. Well, I want to thank you both again so much for giving us your time today and talking about this wonderful book, The Ends Game. Again, like I said earlier, you can learn more about this in the chat and on our website. If you want to support independent bookstores or find an audio or ebook edition, we have a list of different ways you can get your hands on our books. While many of us are social distancing and unable to attend events in person, MIT Press Live is intended to help everyone at home connect with our authors online. So we hope that you'll register for additional events in our series, and you can find them listed at our website, generally every Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. Marco, Ded, thank you both so much for this. This was lovely. We really appreciate your time, and we'll talk to you guys soon, okay?
Thank you very, very much for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone at home. Thank you.